Lesson 12, responsibility for the Holocaust. We're going to take a little bit of an overview lesson now that we're done the major content part of this unit to sort of put it all together. We'll follow this up with lessons 13 and 14, which will look at two of the key controversies that historians debate upon. But this one, too, we'll talk about sort of the historical debate about who was and to what degree were the varying groups responsible for the Holocaust. Of course, no conversation talking about responsibility of the Holocaust can begin without looking at Adolf Hitler himself. Few historians now think that Hitler envisaged and planned the Holocaust from as far away as 1933. Most agree that his fervent anti-Semitism, his long-held beliefs do play a central role in the evolution of Nazi Jewish policy. Of course, whether or not it was planned as a long-term thing, of course, probably not. However, there is no doubt that he approved of the intensification of Jewish persecution throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, and his attitude towards the Jews, being the fact that he expresses no particular stance on it, serves as a legitimizing authority. The fact that Hitler tends to approve, and he can approve by silence or approve by verbally, it legitimizes what people are doing. And he did not concern himself with the details, but gave signals that established the priorities and goals of the Nazi regime, particularly with his consistent anti-Semitic rhetoric. His actions in 1941, what's more, don't seem to indicate that he was set on murdering all of the Jews of Europe. There were too many questions. Why did he pursue immigration? Why did he consistently talk about resettlement? And this is before the terms were used euphemistically. All leading Nazi officials until 1941 declare a policy of compulsory immigration, and they offer this as effectively the only solution. There's absolutely no basis whatsoever to any claim that immigration plans were designed to conceal the regime's genocidal intentions until after the fall of 1941. Given his hatred of the Jews, of course, naturally speaking, the potential for what happened was always there. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, really gave Hitler both the opportunity and the justification to put sort of a final solution to the Jewish problem once and for all on the table. The nature of the struggle, envisioned and in reality was apocalyptic. It made sense in some cases, by Hitler's standards, of course, to order the killing of all of the Russian Jews, and once that was done, of course, to go on and continue to kill all of Europe's Jews. The debate on whether the decision to kill all the Jews was based on the euphoria of success, and the idea that in the July-August 1941 it looks like he was going to completely wipe out the Russians, or whether it was born of fear of defeat, looks set to continue, as the lack of evidence means that people will probably bat this ball around for quite a long time. Kershaw adds, given the nature and gaps in evidence, it is likely that an answer to these fundamental questions will always rest on the balance of probabilities. What is more than likely under the circumstances is a good way of defining the balance of probabilities. Presumably, interestingly enough, because either he feared alienating the German public or for some other reason, but probably that he tried to conceal his own personal responsibility. He always insists that the Jews were being resettled for labor duties. No order whatsoever exists containing an explicit instruction. Nobody talks about a particular time when Hitler commanded them to do this. But the decision taken was undoubtedly his. It is almost unthinkable, and especially even if you consider that the Nazi state was chaotic, even if you're the strongest structuralist. Most tend to agree that a decision of this magnitude would be unthinkable without the express authorized permission of the Fuhrer, given the way that the Nazi state had operated to this point. There's no precedent for a decision of this magnitude to have been taken without his express authorization. Looking as well towards the second group of people responsible, you have to look at Himmler, Heydrich, and the operation of the SS. Speaking of the SS, most of them are not directly involved in the killing, even though they are the ideological arm of the regime. Nor are the SS the only group in Germany or the only part of the Nazi structure that has responsibility. They do play a key role, and they're, I suppose I will say, they're not totally the only organizational body in this. The SS do much of the killing in the USSR. Few of the SS men agonize over the slaughter. Most believe that they're doing their duty. This lets them retain a sense of moral integrity, the fact that, that they believe that what they're doing is part of sort of their overall job, if you will. Few of this SS, despite in many ways popular portrayals, are sadists or psychopaths. These people have a crude, wrong, yet let's say misguided moral logic that lets them again believe that what they're doing is sort of a sacred duty to the fatherland. Himmler himself is convinced, absolutely convinced, about the righteousness of his cause. Other leading Nazis, apart from Himmler, also support harsher anti-Semitic measures. Let's take Goering, for instance. He might have participated to extend his own authority, but at the same time, too, he didn't really speak out at any particular point about the nature of the anti-Semitic measures. He washes his hands of it. However, of course, Goering's anti-Semitism is evident in almost every way. He doesn't have any great conviction to save the Jews. And take Goebbels, on the other hand. Here's a man who is vehemently anti-Semitic and apocalyptically so. And the extent, I suppose, to which other leading Nazis are implicated in the Holocaust remains a matter of debate. Some people like Speer will claim ignorance, although it was pretty clear that he was almost certainly aware of what was going on in the East. And I guess whether men like Speer, who may have recognized the Holocaust as an evil, were more or less responsible or guilty than men like Himmler and Heydrich who went about it, and I say this in the context of Speer, who did nothing to help the Jews whatsoever, is really a matter of a moral question. Whether doing nothing, recognizing it as an evil, or people who believed it was a positive good and did it anyway. I suppose is a question of morality that needs to be addressed, but one that is, of course, with all of these characters being dead, difficult to do at this particular point. The responsibility for the Holocaust can be also traced to the euthanasia connection, and this is something that historians emphasize. Probably, in many ways, the euthanasia killing was an important precedent for the Holocaust. And some wonder to the extent that had the euthanasia policy not gone the way it did in early 1939, then perhaps the Holocaust wouldn't have happened as it did. The success of the mass killing really convinces a lot of the Nazi leaders that the mass murder of Jews is a technical possibility. And to that end, the trained personnel from the euthanasia project, that Action T4, end up being many of the people involved in the final solution. Of course, at least 90 of the several hundred people who learned their trade end up working in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka during Operation Reinhardt. The killing technique discovered in Operation T4, particularly the use of gas, is replicated in the final solution. And it does show, very importantly, that individuals, largely selected at random, would carry out mass killings without scruple. So there's a sort of the sense of, no, I suppose, more sense that we have to go and find out the most ruthless killers of this Gulag or whatnot. The German army and police also hold a degree of responsibility, of course. Historians now agree that the regular army units provided essential support for the Einsatzgruppen in 1941 and 1942. The Army High Command, of course, accepts there's a need for harsh members against Jews and communists because they basically see them as the same deadly enemy. The Army works collaboratively with the SS in the occupied territories. German officers all believe that Jews are behind much of the partisan activity, especially on the Russian front. And within the German army, things like pity and softness are seen as really dangerous weaknesses, and therefore all measure of activity is justified in the battle against Jewish Bolshevism. So the army actions, what we see, particularly in the East, take on an aspect of an extension of Nazi racial policy more than military procedure. Take one example, the 707th Infantry Division. In 1 month, they shoot 10,431 captives out of a total of 10,940 that they actually took. They claimed, of course, this was due to partisan activity, but the division only suffers 7 casualties, 2 dead and 5 wounded in the same period. So what we see here is a justification for those killings that was given to be partisan, but really, when you look at the heart of it, there's no other logical conclusion that can be drawn other than the fact that this was ideological. And to that end, what makes it interesting is the degree of study that's been looked at into Reserve Battalion 101, looked at because of the testimonies taken in the 1960s and 1970s and the surviving records for this particular group. This is a battalion of approximately 1,500 men. Well, no, it's not itself. The Reserve Battalions, rather the police battalions, had 1,500 men. Reserve Battalion 101 consisted of approximately 500. The historians who have studied this include both Christopher Browning and Daniel Goldhagen, and they focused really heavily on these men. There's plenty of evidence, as I said, due to the sort of the war crimes testimony of the 1950s and 60s. And what makes these guys really interesting is that they're a near perfect cross-section of the Third Reich society. You have skilled, unskilled workers, shopkeepers, farmers, civil servants, academics, and middle managers. And what is really stressed by Browning and Goldhagen equally is the fact that this is the most ordinary group of individuals you've ever met. They're not an elite. They're not selected for their killing prowess or their ideological fitness. Most are not fanatical Nazis. Only 1 in 30 were a member of the SS. 1/3 of the members of Reserve Police Battalion 101 were actual Nazi party members, and the average age was 36. Most of these people had families, wives, and children, and they understood what they were doing. What's more is that the men who become some of the biggest killers on the Eastern Front were not actually trained whatsoever to do the killing. And their ideological training, their sort of, their Nazi indoctrination, if you will, was a mere 2 hours a week. The officers themselves, none of them are hardcore Nazis, so they can't necessarily say that we were forced to by our officers who were ideological anti-Semites, for instance. And so when you really look at it, these aren't a real promising group of killers, yet they become one under the circumstances. What's even more horrifying is not only do they become killers, they kill in an extraordinarily personal way. They kill in a manner where they hold the guns to people's head. They're often splattered with the blood of babies, children, and women, these people who are their victims. And none of them were forced to act this way. Cruelty was not an order of the state. Okay? Himmler did not say, be excessively cruel to the people that you kill. Those who were squeamish could leave. They could be transferred to other duties. And what's more, not one individual was punished, not only in Reserve Police Battalion 101, but in all of the police battalions who chose to leave. None of these people were punished, nor, more importantly, did anyone have any seemingly adverse effect on their career. Okay? Most of the people who left, who didn't want to take these roles on because they were ideologically opposed to what was doing, actually got promoted in other aspects of the Third Reich. So the peer pressure, perhaps, pride in toughness, manliness, a general approval of genocide, seems to have been the motivation. And they don't hide their actions from the loved ones. And this forces both Browning, but particularly Goldhagen, to make some particularly difficult conclusions. And his conclusion, ultimately, is that the men of Reserve Battalion 101 were so representative of German society that the inescapable truth is that most of their fellow Germans would have also served as Hitler's willing executioners. Hence, there might be something within the German mentality that could be, detrimental, if you will. One of the interesting points, and I'll, before I get into the bureaucracy, I'll read you a little bit of a letter written by a happily married German man working with one of the police battalions, who wrote it. He wrote it to a friend of his back home, and he said, "We men of Germany must be strict with ourselves, even if it means a long period of separation from our family. For we must finish matters once and for all and finally settle accounts with the war criminals in order to create a better and eternal Germany for our heirs. There are 3 or 4 operations a week, sometimes gypsies, other times Jews, partisans, and all sorts of trash. I am grateful for having been allowed to see this bastard race close up. If fate permits, I shall have something to tell my children. Syphilitics, cripples, idiots are typical of all of them. The one thing is clear, they were materialists to the end. They were saying things like, we are skilled workers, you're not going to shoot us. They were not men, but monkeys in human form. Ah well, there is only a small percentage of the 224,000 Jews in this area left. We are ruthlessly making a queen sleep, and doing so with a clear conscience." Moving on from that to the bureaucracy, we see historian Ralph Hilberg, who's written quite clearly on the bureaucracy, amongst other things. We'll come back to him a little bit later. And he claims that the final solution was essentially an administrative process, one that involved the participation of bureaucrats from every organization in Germany. Though they didn't initiate the Holocaust, they were an essential part of the machinery of destruction. When set in motion, the sort of machinery grounds on, generating its own momentum and needing no operator. So, in a very structuralist way, he's or functionalist, I should say, he's painting a picture that the bureaucracy was in many ways the engine of the final solution. What he also notes is that the typical feuds between agencies for power and influence in Nazi Germany actually had no impact on the progress of the final solution whatsoever, and he sees that what it is a smooth bureaucratic process. After the war, many of the bureaucrats, diplomats, civil servants, policemen, railway officials, of course, claimed they weren't aware of or responsible for the end result of their work. Eichmann himself, who was the expert in deportation, said that his authority only extended to the gates of Auschwitz, not beyond. Complicity, in this case, is not marked by any single turning point, but a gradual, almost imperceptible descent past the point of no return. And notably, because the regime camouflaged what was happening. So many officials didn't know the fate of those that were departed. No means were most of the bureaucrats Nazi zealots, but no one at the same time seemed to question the result of their work. And in fact, most of them seemed incredibly committed to doing their part to contribute to the machinery of destruction. There's also an important point to consider when we look at the European responsibility. And I'm going to give you guys a little bit of extra reading on this because it's interesting to look at the degree to which each country was responsible. But I'll say this. Between 1940 and 1944, of course, the Germans dominate most of Europe, and they press their conquered states to deport the Jews. Cooperation will vary. And after the war, sort of non-German collaborators will protest their innocence and ignorance of the ultimate intentions for the Jews. No doubt, however, that without the strength of latent European anti-Semitism, the Nazi implementation of the final solution and the degree to which they were able to go about it would not have happened. The intensity of anti-Semitism in a particular country usually, not always, affects how far the destruction process went. But in final analysis, the degree of control, not necessarily the extent of anti-Semitism, seems to be the decisive factor in determining the number of Jews killed. So yes, it is true that if the country was particularly anti-Semitic, there was a high degree of the Jewish population killed, but not always, if there was heavy control. So let's give a really good example. The Netherlands, which was a problematic state for the Nazis as there was quite a lot of partisanship and resistance, had a high degree of Nazi control. A government established in the Netherlands that was brutally coercive. And the people of the Netherlands themselves are not that anti-Semitic. Compare that, I guess, with Romania, which is very anti-Semitic, and we see that the Netherlands, with its high rate of Jewish death, an incredible amount of the Jewish population of the Netherlands is exterminated in the final solution, actually, in proportionately speaking, have a higher death rate than that of Romania. And that's not down to anti-Semitism, that's down to the fact that the Nazis put in a brutal coercive regime to crush the will of the people of the Netherlands into conforming with the Nazis. A controversial topic, of course, is that of the Jewish responsibility. By 1942, most Jews knew what resettlement meant, and Raul Hillenberg controversially writes on this topic as well, and he actually blames the Jews themselves, and he blames particularly the Jewish leaders for not offering more in the way of resistance. In his view, the fact that Jews tried to avoid provocation, that they complied with the Nazi orders, this helps seal their fate. Hannah Arendt argues that Jewish leaders actually collaborate with the Germans, and she says without their assistance, Nazi manpower would have been so far overstretched that far fewer would have died. And she calls the Jewish participation in their own destruction the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. Much of the Holocaust process did rely on Jewish participation. Some prisoners came to hold the SS guards as role models. Some were sadistically cruel to their fellow inmates and their own people. Some betrayed fellow prisoners to seek privileges for themselves. These are yet but a few of the pieces of evidence that these individuals use. On the other hand, and in defense of the Jews, most historians are contrary to the beliefs of Arnett and Hilberg. They're sympathetic to the plight of the Jews and far less critical than Hilberg and Arendt. Until 1942, they say most Jews are unaware of what was happening, and it made no sense, or made sense, and rather, to appease the Nazis. And when they figure out that what resettlement meant, the fact that it meant death, many face a terrible dilemma. Armed resistance is effectively mass suicide, therefore there's no alternative but submission, perhaps. Some cling to hope that the German policy might change and part of the community would at least survive, so there's this not fatalist but preservationalist mindset. A lot of the criticism on the Jews, of course, is based around the fact that they used the wrong tactics. But, you know, it's hard to consider what tactics would have been right in the circumstances. What tactics would have worked in the Warsaw or Lodz ghetto? Most Poles and Russian Jews were killed before the networks could be established, and resistance results in mass reprisals. Let's take an example. In the Ukraine, when one Jew attacked a German with a dagger, stabbing him, not even fatally, an entire trainload of deportees was machine gunned in retaliation. So the slightest resistance was met with the incomprehensible brutality on part of the Germans. Other historians actually point out that there was more Jewish resistance than we oftentimes give the Jews credit for, or that had been previously thought. Some even claim that it's proportionately higher than that of other Nazi victims. Okay, but it's also, I suppose, difficult to tell how much there was because so many of the people who resisted ended up dead. Let's put it. One of the things they point to is the fact that there are 3.3 million Soviet POWs who die under the Nazis, and under no circumstances at any point did the Soviets ever really resist their capture or the conditions of their forced enslavement in many ways. Others look at the Warsaw Ghetto of April of 1943. At the Warsaw Ghetto, you have 60,000 survivors fighting off deportation for a month. There was only one gun for every 150 people. Ammunition was even more scarce in many ways. And so by May 1943, you see that the ghetto itself is liquidated, and 56,000 of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto are killed in the process, and the rest of them transported to the camps. Only 16 Germans died. So this really gives you an idea that the fact that the Jews were willing to put up a fight, even though the sort of resistance was in fact futile. And in the camps themselves, resistance was nearly impossible. Though in October 1943, a mass escape takes place in Sobibor, where 13 guards are killed. All but 70 escapees are recaptured and shot. There were minor escapes in tents at Auschwitz and Treblinka, but realistically within the camps themselves, most Jews tried to, cling on to, if they were allowed to live beyond the first 2 hours of arriving there, some form of meager existence. One of the major reasons that there's not many escape attempts is the fact that, of course, in the camps, the Nazis used terror to destroy the Jews mentally and physically. Most, like I said, will concentrate their energies in the day-to-day struggle for food or, be allocated to work detachments. And to stay alive, effectively, was to conform. So the Jews did subvert the Nazi plans in some respect. In the eastern ghettos, German rulers were subverted on a massive scale. There was a large black market activity, clandestine meetings, religious ceremonies, even though they were banned. You have all sorts of examples of weddings, bar mitzvah, brises, and all that stuff happening when these people are living through the most horrific conditions imaginable. Thousands will escape, but most of these don't survive. And a large reason of that is the fact that it's completely inhospitable from November through March in Poland and the eastern states where many of these people were kept. And try and live in the woods in Poland. Good luck. You'll probably end up freezing to death. In the USSR, escapees had more of a chance of survival because of the partisan networks were more willing to help them. Some also blame Palestinian and American Jews. In 1945, many survivors of the Holocaust criticized these Jews in particular for not doing more, though they didn't really know what was happening in many cases till after the war, that is, those living in Palestine and the United States. Palestinian Jews themselves are divided on whether or not to concentrate their efforts on how to help or focus on creating a viable state in Palestine. And had they not been divided, there's also, I suppose, little evidence to show that they could have done anything. They could have done anything at all to help, even if they had tried. The American Jews are only a small percentage of the American population, and they had little impact on Roosevelt, though they tried in trying to get him to change his policy or work with the Germans to bring more Jews over. One of the last things we have to consider, and the second last thing, is that of the Allies. It's hard to see what Britain and France could have done. The war conditions made rescue almost impossible. Buying the Jews when they were held up as ransom would have only strengthened the enemy and made it harder to fight the Nazis. The British government broadcast the news of the killings all over the world. They issued warnings that the war crimes would be severely punished. The notion that they erected a barrier to the Jews that they could not surmount is actually completely wrong. Those who seek to blame the British or the Western European states need to consider the fact that 70% of German, Austrian, and Czech Jews actually managed to escape the Third Reich, predominantly to Britain, the United States, and France before 1939. Though unfortunately, those who ended up escaping to France and some of these Western states, of course, end up again into the dragnet of the Holocaust, of course, when these areas are occupied by the Germans. But that's not to say that the states did not accept Jews whatsoever. And lastly, we are remiss not to forget that there's a great deal of responsibility needs to be placed on the Catholic Church. Pope Pius XII, who becomes Pope in 1939, does not speak out in defense of the Jews and does not condone the Holocaust or the Nazis. He had excellent, or rather the Vatican itself had excellent connections in Poland. They had a net informants all over Europe. The Vatican knew exactly what was going on. And therefore, it is incredibly tough to defend the Vatican's silence. And it's important to note that many German, Austrian, Croats are Catholics. And an appeal to these individuals could have helped significantly. And it had been proven to stop people's actions in all sorts of issues in the past. And Pope Pius's fear, really, of communism more than anything else, he feared communism because communism is expressly anti-church or anti-clerical. And he feared communism more than Nazism or fascism. And as such, he expresses no views on the great moral issue of the century. And his silence amounts to complicity in this regard. This is one of the terrible legacies that the Catholic Church has to deal with. Only when it was clear, I suppose, that the Nazis are going to lose the war does the Pope actually finally speak out, and he sympathizes with the plight of the Jews. Nevertheless, Catholic bishops in Germany, with no clear direction from the Vatican, remained loyal to Hitler to the very end of the war. Protestant churches in Europe, for that matter, have no better record. 90% of Germans are church-going Christians, and their religious leaders seem to have been unconcerned with the plight of the Jews, leaving a terrible moral question unanswered, particularly for the Catholic Church. And something actually interesting enough, the last popes have issued apologies for. That said, there's a brief overview of the responsibility and some of the historical debate of who was responsible for the Holocaust. We'll look at the two key questions, predominantly when was the decision made for the Holocaust and the degree to which Hitler himself was responsible over the next couple lessons.